He called him a snake, not a rival, not a critic, a snake. That's the word Joey Barton used about Alan Shearer on a podcast in 2024, more than a decade after they shared a dressing room at Newcastle United. And the strange part? Shearer never really responded. He didn't need to, because here's what most people get wrong about Alan Shearer. They remember the goals. 260 in the Premier League, a record that stood since before some of you were even watching football. They remember the raised arm, the stiff upper lip celebration, the England captain's armband, the statue outside the stadium. What they don't talk about is the list. The short, specific list of people Alan Shearer has, at different points in his career, absolutely despised. Not disliked. Not had a difference of opinion with. Despised. A manager who humiliated him in front of 52,000 people. A midfielder who tried to end his career with a tackle that's still shown in worst fouls compilations 25 years later. A teammate he had to discipline instead of protect. And an owner he spent over a decade publicly warning would destroy the club he loves. For names. For fights. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand something most Shearer profiles miss completely. Every single one of those conflicts made him more respected, not less. This isn't a story about a man who burned bridges. It's a story about a man who found out exactly what he stood for by figuring out who he couldn't stand. Let's start at number 4. The least explosive on paper. The most revealing underneath. Newcastle, early 2009. The club is in a relegation dogfight that will eventually end with them dropping into the championship for the first time in 16 years. Panic isn't a strong enough word for the mood inside St. James Park that spring. The board is in chaos. The manager, Joe Kinnear, has left the job on health grounds. And in steps Alan Shearer, Newcastle legend, hometown hero, record goalscorer, brought in for 8 games as interim manager to try to save the club he'd captained for a decade. It's about as high-pressure a job as English football offers. 8 games, 1 shot, a city's entire football identity hanging on it. And in the middle of that pressure cooker, Newcastle travel to Liverpool. Joey Barton, a combustible, talented, and already controversial midfielder, gets sent off. A reckless, needless red card in a game Newcastle desperately needed a result from. Down to 10 men, already fighting for their lives, Newcastle's survival odds take another hit. In a match, in a season, where every single point was already a fight to the death. Now here's the part that matters. Shearer doesn't protect him. A lot of managers, especially first-time ones under that kind of pressure, would close ranks. Defend the player publicly, deal with it quietly, keep the dressing room united against the outside world. That's the instinct. Protect your own project unity. Save the war of words for the pitch. Shearer does the opposite. He disciplines Barton. Publicly acknowledges the recklessness of it. Draws a hard line in a moment where softness would have been so much easier to sell. To be fair for a second, man management in football is rarely black and white. Plenty of legendary managers have built entire careers on loyalty to their players above all else, on shielding them from criticism so completely that trust becomes unbreakable. There's a genuine argument that Shearer, brand new to management, untested in the politics of a professional dressing room, could have played this differently and maybe kept the whole squad rowing in one direction instead. But Shearer didn't come up as a manager first. He came up as a center forward who spent 17 years learning that discipline wins matches, that standards don't bend just because the table looks ugly. And in that Liverpool aftermath, discipline is exactly what he chose, consequences and popularity be damned. Newcastle go down that season anyway. Shearer's brief spell in the dugout ends in relegation, and by his own admission, it's one of the most painful periods of his professional life, watching the club he loved drop out of the top flight with him in the dugout for the first time. Barton, for his part, never really lets it go. Flash forward to 2024, and there he is on a podcast, still carrying it, still bitter, calling his old caretaker manager a snake. The implication being that Shearer chose reputation and image over protecting his own player when it mattered most. Shearer's response? Largely silence. No podcast rebuttal, no soundbite war, no late-night statement clarifying his side. Just the same thing he's done with every conflict on this list. Let time and results speak instead of him. And here's the thing about that particular fight. It's easy, from a distance, to score cheap points saying Shearer threw a struggling club under the bus for his own image. It's a lot harder to actually be the man in the room under those lights, telling a talented, volatile player that a moment of ill discipline just made an already desperate situation worse, while that club is bleeding money and sliding toward the trapdoor in real time, in front of a fan base watching every second of it. Discipline over popularity. That's lesson 1. And it's the least personal, least dramatic entry on this list, which is exactly why it belongs at number 4. Because what's coming next gets a lot more painful, a lot more public, and a lot more humiliating. October 1999. The Tyne Wear Derby. Newcastle versus Sunderland, arguably the most feverish, most emotionally loaded fixture in English football outside of anything involving Glasgow. And Alan Shearer, Newcastle's captain, Newcastle's icon, the man whose statue would one day stand outside the stadium, is dropped to the bench. Not injured, not rested for a cup replay 3 days later. Dropped by his own manager for the biggest game on the calendar. The manager in question is Ruud Gullit, a genuine footballing great in his own right, a Ballon d'Or winner, a man who built his reputation on a philosophy of sexy football, fluid, expressive, continental. And in Gullit's eyes, that philosophy apparently didn't have room for a traditional target man built the way Shearer was built. So he leaves him out, in front of a sold-out St. James Park, in front of a fan base that worships Shearer the way some cities worship saints. Newcastle lose 2-1. The fallout is instant and brutal. Not from Shearer, from everyone else around him. The press descends within hours. The fans are furious, and they're not quiet about it. Gullit is accused of arrogance, of ego, of sacrificing the club's biggest fixture of the season just to prove a tactical point against a legend he apparently never even asked to buy into his system in the first place. And Shearer? He doesn't go to the papers. He doesn't organize a dressing room revolt. He doesn't demand a transfer or leak his frustration through friendly journalists the way plenty of stars in his position might have. He just gets on with it. That restraint is the whole story here, because it's what happens next that turns this from a humiliation into a genuine turning point. The pressure on Gullit doesn't ease, it multiplies by the day. Just 5 days later, Newcastle lose again. This time in a game that only piles further scrutiny onto a manager already under siege. And the writing is on the wall. Gullit resigns. 24 hours after a legend gets benched for the biggest game of the season. The manager who benched him is gone. Now, to be fair, this isn't some cartoonish revenge arc where Shearer plots and schemes his manager out of a job from the shadows. Nothing suggests he did anything but train, wait, and let the results make the argument for him. But the optics were undeniable, and optics matter in football as much as facts do. A club that benches its captain for its biggest rival fixture, loses and implodes within days, sends one message loud and clear to everyone watching. Some players are bigger than a system, whether the manager wants to admit it or not. Enter Bobby Robson. Robson takes over a fractured, demoralized Newcastle side and does something Gullit never managed. He rebuilds the team around Shearer instead of despite him. Under Robson, Shearer doesn't just recover his place. He reinvents himself. He becomes more of a complete forward, holding up play, linking with younger attackers, using experience and positioning where his legs start to lose half a yard of the pace that once terrified defenders across Europe. Newcastle, under Robson, climb from relegation fringe conversation to genuine Champions League qualification within a couple of seasons. Shearer becomes not just the club's record goalscorer, but the emotional and tactical center of its most successful modern era. So here's the twist buried inside this one. Gullit's benching wasn't just an insult Shearer absorbed and quietly moved past. It was, in hindsight, the exact moment that forced Newcastle to decide what kind of club it actually wanted to be. A fashionable experiment chasing continental philosophy for its own sake, or a club built on its own history, its own captain, its own identity. They chose Shearer. And Shearer, humiliated in front of his own home crowd by a Ballon d'Or winner, answered not with words, not with a transfer request, but by becoming even more essential to the club than he already was. That's rivalry number 3. A manager who thought he could build a great team without its greatest player, and got his answer inside a single week. Now we move into the two conflicts that aren't really about hurt pride anymore. These are closer to war. If you know one moment on this entire list without needing any context at all, It's probably this one. September 2001, St. James Park. Newcastle host Manchester United, and two of the most intense, most uncompromising personalities English football has ever produced collide, quite literally. Roy Keane, Manchester United's captain, a midfielder whose entire reputation was built on a kind of controlled fury, total commitment, zero tolerance for weakness, teammates and opponents alike genuinely wary of letting him down or getting in his way. And Alan Shearer, Newcastle's own captain, a striker who built his career on using his physicality as a weapon just as ruthlessly, just with a colder, more calculated kind of aggression, patient, waiting for the exact moment to punish a defender rather than lashing out early. Put two players like that on the same pitch in a rivalry fixture with both captaincies and both reputations on the line, and you get exactly what happened that day, a genuinely explosive confrontation. Words exchanged before kickoff. Tempers still raw once the whistle goes. A moment where Keane goes in on Shearer with a challenge reckless enough that it's still replayed today in hardest tackles in Premier League history compilations. A moment that could have ended a season, if not a career, in an instant. It wasn't staged. It wasn't manufactured for the cameras. Two elite, hyper-competitive captains simply refused to back down from each other, in front of a stadium that fed off every single second of it. Let's be fair for a moment because it's important context. This wasn't some one-sided act of aggression from a villain against an innocent victim. Shearer gave as good as he got, verbally and physically, throughout that rivalry year after year. Keane wasn't the only one with a reputation for intensity that spilled over the line. This was two of the most fearsome competitors of their generation matching each other blow for blow, neither one willing to be the first to blink. What makes this entry different from everything else on this list, though, is where it eventually ends up. Because Shearer and Keane didn't stay enemies forever. Fast forward past retirement, past the trophies and the testimonials and the highlight reels, and you'll find both of them sitting behind the same punditry desks today, working together, trading analysis, occasionally even needling each other on camera in a way that feels less like old wounds reopening and more like mutual respect wearing the mask of banter. That's the twist buried in this one. The Keane rivalry wasn't fueled by disrespect. It was fueled by the exact opposite. Two players who recognized in each other the same relentless standard they held themselves to, and who simply couldn't stand watching the other one fail to meet it at their own expense. That kind of rivalry, the kind built on respect underneath the aggression, has a strange way of aging into something closer to friendship once the competition itself stops matching. Compare that to Barton, who still, over a decade later, carries genuine resentment into a microphone. Compare it to Goulet, whose Newcastle spell simply ended before any real reconciliation was even possible. Keane is the one entry on this entire list where despised cools over time into something that looks a lot like admiration. There's actually a broader pattern hiding inside the Keane rivalry that's worth pulling apart for a second, because it tells you something about how Shearer picked his battles throughout his whole career. He never really clashed with players he considered soft opposition. The ones he tangled with hardest were almost always the ones operating at his own level or above it. Captains, leaders, players other teams were built around. It's a strange kind of compliment buried inside a rivalry. You don't get a genuinely dangerous tackle from an opponent who doesn't rate you as a threat worth neutralizing. Keane went in hard on Shearer precisely because Shearer was the kind of striker capable of deciding the whole afternoon on his own, and both men, deep down, knew it. But that pattern, respect quietly sitting underneath the rivalry the whole time, is about to disappear completely. Because rivalry number one isn't a player. It isn't even a manager. It's an owner. And this one doesn't get a redemption arc built on mutual respect once the whistle blows for the final time. This one gets over a decade of open, sustained public war. Here's where this list stops being about football matches and starts being about something much bigger. The actual soul of a football club. Mike Ashley bought Newcastle United in 2007. And for the better part of the next 14 years, Alan Shearer became one of his most consistent, most public, most unrelenting critics. Not as a disgruntled ex-player chasing headlines, but as someone who genuinely could not sit quietly and watch what was happening to the club he'd given his entire career to. The list of grievances is long, and it built year after year rather than exploding all at once, which is exactly what made it so damning in the end. Investment in the academy dried up at a time when neighboring clubs were pouring resources into developing the next generation of talent. Ambition on the pitch got replaced, in Shearer's view and in the view of a huge portion of the fan base, by a survival-first, cost-cutting operating model, a club with genuine Champions League pedigree and one of the biggest, loudest fan bases in the country being run like it should feel grateful just to avoid the drop every season. Community ties that once made Newcastle feel like it truly belonged to the city started to fray, year on year, as sponsorship decisions, communication with supporters, and matchday pricing all drew heavy criticism for prioritizing the balance sheet over the bond with the fans in the stands. Shearer said all of it out loud, repeatedly, on television, in interviews, as one of the sport's most recognizable pundits with a platform most retired players never get access to. He wasn't the only voice criticizing Ashley's ownership over the years. Supporter groups organized boycotts, protests, and sustained social media campaigns for well over a decade, but Shearer's voice carried a weight none of them could quite match. This was Newcastle's own record goalscorer, its former captain, its most beloved modern-era icon, telling the world on camera, again and again, that the man in charge of the club was failing it. To be fair to Ashley for a moment, running a Premier League club is not simple, and financial caution isn't automatically the villain's move it so often gets painted as. Plenty of clubs have overspent themselves into genuine crisis chasing exactly the kind of ambition Shearer was demanding, and ended up worse off for it. There's a version of this story where Ashley's caution reads as prudence rather than neglect, a version where he simply refused to gamble a community institution on reckless spending. But it's very hard to make that version of the story stick when you look at what happened the moment Ashley finally sold. And it's worth remembering just how long this actually dragged on for, because that's the part that gets lost when people compress 14 years into a highlight reel. This wasn't one angry rant during one bad season. It was Shearer on Match of the Day on Sky Sports, in newspaper columns year after year after year, watching promising academy prospects leave for bigger clubs because Newcastle couldn't or wouldn't compete for them. It was watching managers come and go, some of them genuinely talented, all of them working with one hand tied behind their back financially, while rival clubs a fraction of Newcastle's size in fanbase terms spent freely. It was watching a stadium that used to be one of the most intimidating atmospheres in English football feel, at its lowest points, resigned rather than roaring. October 2021. A Saudi-backed consortium completes a takeover of Newcastle United. And almost overnight, everything Shearer had been saying for over a decade about ambition, about investment, about what the club could actually be if only someone would run it to compete, starts to look less like bitterness and more like prophecy. The takeover triggers scenes of raw, overwhelming celebration inside and outside St. James Park, the kind you rarely see outside of actual trophy wins. Investment starts flowing into the squad almost immediately. Within a few seasons, Newcastle are back in Europe, back in genuine title conversations, back competing at the level Shearer had spent years insisting they were fully capable of, if only someone would actually back the club the way its history and its supporters deserved. And through all of it, Shearer's position never wavers, never gets softened for the cameras, never turns into a cheap, "I told you so" victory lap dragged out purely for clicks. He simply keeps saying what he'd always said, that Newcastle United, run properly, deserved to be a genuinely competitive club again. The takeover didn't validate a grudge. It validated a standard he'd been holding the club to for the entire 14 years Ashley owned it, through relegations, near misses, and a fan base that at times felt completely powerless. That's what separates this entry from every other name on this list. Barton was personal, and it stayed personal, unresolved, a wound that never closed. Goulet was tactical, and it resolved itself quickly within a single club's dressing room and boardroom. Keane was competitive fire that eventually cooled into mutual respect once the football stopped mattering between them. But Ashley was institutional. It was never about Shearer's ego, his pride, or his personal relationship with one man in a suit. It was about whether the club he loved was being allowed to be what it was always supposed to be. 14 years of public criticism, sustained not through outrage bait but through sheer consistency, vindicated in a single takeover announcement and everything that followed it. That's not drama for drama's sake. That's about as close as football ever gets to an actual verdict. And unlike the other three names on this list, this one didn't just affect Shearer's own legacy. It shaped what an entire generation of Newcastle fans grew up expecting from ownership, a reference point for what happens when a club's own history gets treated as a burden instead of an asset, and what it looks like when someone with a real platform refuses to let that slide quietly. So step back for a second and look at these 4 names side by side. Joey Barton, Ruud Gullit, Roy Keane, Mike Ashley, player, a manager, a fellow captain, an owner, for completely different relationships, for completely different kinds of conflict, and yet every single one of them reveals the exact same core trait sitting underneath Alan Shearer's entire career. With Barton, it was discipline chosen over popularity, even when popularity would have been so much easier to sell in the middle of a relegation fight that felt like it could end everything. With Gullit, it was resilience, absorbing a deeply public humiliation without retaliation, without sabotage, and simply letting results do the talking instead of his mouth. With Keane, it was competitive respect, the kind of rivalry so intense it could only ever be fueled by recognizing genuine greatness in the person actively trying to destroy you on the pitch. And with Ashley, it was loyalty to something bigger than himself, a willingness to spend over a decade of his media career saying uncomfortable, unpopular things about a club's ownership, not because it made him more famous, but because he actually cared what happened to Newcastle United long after his boots were hung up for good. For different tests, for completely different kinds of pressure, spread across 4 completely different decades of his life. And in every single one, Shearer comes out the other side with his reputation not just intact, but somehow stronger than it was before the conflict even started. Maybe that's the real lesson buried inside all of this, that despising someone, in Shearer's case, was never really about hate at all. It was about holding a standard high enough that falling short of it, whether you were a reckless young midfielder, an experimental foreign manager, a fierce title rival, or a cost-cutting owner sitting 1,000 miles away from the fans he answered to, was always going to create friction somewhere down the line. The people who clashed with Shearer weren't punished simply for being different from him. They were confronted because he refused to lower the bar just to keep the peace, even when keeping the peace would have made his life so much easier. That's a much harder way to build a career than just scoring goals and staying quiet in every interview. But it's probably exactly why, all these years later, people are still making videos about who Alan Shearer couldn't stand, and why every single name on that list still means something to anyone who actually lived through it. So here's the question worth actually sitting with for a second. Joey Barton still calls him a snake, more than a decade on, with no sign of that fading. Mike Ashley's entire era ended in total vindication for everything Shearer had argued for years. Roy Keane became a colleague, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the same panel. Ruud Gullit's Newcastle spell lasted barely 6 months after that derby benching, over before most fans had even adjusted to him being there, for different men, for completely different outcomes. One common thread running straight through every single one of them. So I'll leave it with you, out of these 4, which conflict do you think actually reveals the most about who Alan Shearer really is, underneath the goals and the record and the statue outside the ground? The discipline with Barton? The restraint with Gullit? The fire with Keane? Or the 14-year fight with Ashley that ended up rewriting the entire future of the club? Because that's really what this whole list boils down to when you strip away the drama. For men who, in their own way, tested whether Alan Shearer actually meant what he stood for when nobody was forcing him to prove it. A struggling player who needed protecting instead of discipline. A manager who thought reputation alone should buy loyalty. A rival who needed to know exactly how far Shearer could be pushed before he pushed back. And an owner who assumed silence would eventually win out over 14 years of pressure. Every single one of them found out the same thing in the end. Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. A like genuinely helps more than you'd think, especially on videos like this one. And subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the rivalries and controversies that actually shaped the players we think we already know everything about. Football at this level is never just about the goals scored or the trophies lifted. It's a moment in time,